Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. A podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories. The unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Hello everybody, welcome to Kinda Murdery. I'm your host, Zevon Odelberg. You know, sometimes people think that our predilection for and the media's predilection for hyperbole is a modern thing fueled by social media and the internet and the 24-hour news cycle, etc. But the truth is, Americans have nearly always had a love affair with hyperbole, with exaggeration. In fact, there are 3 different trials that the media dubbed the trial of the century, and that are often referred to by legal scholars as the trial of the century. What's a little bit funny, as it relates to our love affair with exaggeration, is that all 3 of these trials took place within a decade of each other. 2 of them within a year of each other. Perhaps they should have been competing for trial of the decade, but indeed the stakes were high and the participants famous. The 3 trials I'm referring to, of course, 1924's Leopold and Loeb case, 1925's John Scopes monkey trial, and 1934's Lindbergh baby trial. For a triplet of trials of the century that all happened within a decade of each other, these cases are all very different. 2 of them, however, have one key thing in common. Famous, or perhaps, depending on who you ask, infamous, defense attorney Clarence Darrow would defend the accused in both the Leopold and Loeb case and the John Scopes monkey trial. The crimes themselves were wildly unalike, however. Leopold and Loeb were accused of horrific child murder with a chisel, no less. John Scopes of teaching evolutionary science to his students. If you're wondering which trial we're going to cover today, this is kinda murdery, so it will not be the John Scopes evolution trial. We are, in fact, going to wade into what some still consider to be the most notorious crime in American history, the Chicago horror, Leopold and Loeb. Kinda Murdery starts now. It was a pleasant, sunny, spring afternoon in Chicago on May 21st, 1924, and 14-year-old Robert Franks was on his way home from school. He made the kind of progress that all boys in that era would make on a day like this. There were steam shovels to inspect, baseball games to be umpired, new bikes to be tried out. If he didn't return home right away, well, so what? That was to be expected, and certainly no cause for alarm. His parents had learned to accept with patience his boyish refusals to return home on time. If Robert's parents were worried at all, it was only that he make it home in time for dinner, and in this duty, Robert rarely, if ever, failed. The Franks were a wealthy family who lived in a large mansion and employed a live-in serving staff. At a little after 6 o'clock that evening, Mr. Franks sent 2 of the house servants in search of his prodigal son. During their absence, father and mother sat down to supper and with a few quiet words agreed upon the plan of further impressing upon their youthful wanderer the importance of being prompt and responsible. By 7 o'clock, their anxiety had developed into profound worry. Mrs. Franks begged her husband to inquire into the reasons for Robert's prolonged absence. She worried that something might have happened to him, but Mr. Franks was inclined to regard it lightly. He sought to dispel her doubts with the suggestion that Robert might have gone to a playmate's house and been persuaded to remain there for supper. "But I'm sure he would call me," persisted the mother. Mr. Franks put on his coat and hat and strode out the door of his massive home in search of the heir to his millions. While Mr. Franks was out, the servants returned. They were empty-handed. Robert had left the Harvard School, a private boys' institution located 4 blocks away, at the regular hour of dismissal. This they'd gleaned from the boys and groups of girls still playing in the neighboring streets. Despite inquiring from door to door, they found out nothing further. Robert, by all appearances, had simply and completely disappeared. The lines on Mrs. Franks' face deepened. She began to pace the floor. For one whom riches dispelled all domestic details and difficulties, Mrs. Franks suddenly became conscious of them. Previously, the telephone had been, well, perhaps just a means of communication, a convenient household equipment, and more often, a necessary nuisance. She looked at it hungrily. Would it bring news of Robert? Perhaps it was out of order. She picked it up, lifted the receiver, and heard the operator's reassuring soprano greeting. So the telephone was working, but why didn't somebody call? She studied the great oak door that led out into a spacious area that was more like a palace portico than a porch. Who would be the first to come through that door? Her son? Her husband? She gasped. Would it be an ambulance attendant? At the thought, Mrs. Franks swayed and fell to the floor in a dead faint. The servants rushed to her. Her limp form was carried to a sofa, and trembling hands worked over it. Down the block, Jacob Franks was ringing the bell at the door of Samuel Edelston, Corporation Counsel for the City of Chicago, and a warm friend of Franks. They were confidants, and as soon as he was admitted to the house, Mr. Franks informed his friend of the undue absence of his son. "But Jacob," remonstrated Mr. Edelston, "it isn't yet 9 o'clock. I'm sure you're over-anxious about this. Come, chances are Robbie's decided to see a movie twice through." No. The father was sure he knew his son. Robert wouldn't do this. No, he's never absented himself without a word of explanation, nothing like this. I'm worried. Put your hat on. We'll take a walk and look around. The two sauntered off. One of the pair occasionally halted a passing boy. "Have you seen my son Robert?" "No, mister, I ain't seen him. Is he lost?" They moved on, the friend consoling and the father unconsolable. "Have you seen Robert?" "No." The question began to burn. The voice quivered. The boys were blunt with their answers. It was nope or and just a shake of the head. Darkness was beginning to envelop the streets. Gradually, Mr. Edelston was forced to agree with Jacob Franks. The situation was serious. From that hour on, the situation for Mr. Franks was to be more than serious. It was to be a stark and haunting tragedy. A tragedy that no friend's smiles, comfort, or pity could soften. Tragedy that would slay him by torturous degrees. An hour more of tireless tramping around found Mr. Franks and his friend before the darkened windows of the Harvard School. A suspicion that perhaps Robert Franks might, under certain unexplainable circumstances, have been locked in the school building occurred to both men, and they tried various doors but with no avail. Not to be frustrated so easily, they decided upon an unconventional method of entry. Here is where the story does something that we call crossing the Rubicon. The disappearance of Robert Franks is no longer a private matter, a forgettable family incident. By virtue of the fact that a prominent millionaire and a senior public official climbed through the window of a school building at night, the case of missing boy Robert Franks became news. But not yet. For now we stay with the panicked father and his friend as they wearily search for the young boy. Eventually, they give up on the school. They had covered every room. They had shouted and called until the tremor of fear in their voices gave back such mournful echoes that they became silent and depressed. They departed from the building and made their way to Mr. Franks' home, hopeful though discouraged, apprehensive and yet totally unprepared for the shock that was to greet them. "Why are all the lights on?" said Mr. Franks as they mounted the steps. "I'll bet your long-lost son has returned to the fold," Mr. Edison ventured. But they were met with a state of affairs that nearly sent the father reeling. The occupants of the house were panic-stricken, and their hysterical explanations unintelligible. Mrs. Franks was dangerously ill. Stammering, the maid managed to share that there had been a telephone call. It had come while Mr. Franks was out. The atmosphere of the home was charged with excitement. "Who?" pleaded the frantic father, searching the eyes about him. Mr. Johnson?" the maid stuttered. "Robert has been kidnapped." Such was the beginning of the end. Life for the Franks family had been a sweet, happy existence before this day. Henceforth it was a process of dying, and dying broken-hearted. All the days of their lives were bound up in the bright, affectionate character of their son, Robert. Mr. Edelston took charge of affairs. When Mrs. Franks had recovered her composure sufficiently to speak, he questioned her concerning the phone call. When she lifted the receiver, a strange voice answered her by name and said, "This is Mr. Johnson speaking. As you probably understand, your son has been kidnapped. You can be sure no harm will come to him. Robert has been stolen for ransom. Tomorrow morning you will get complete instructions for the drop." The voice ceased abruptly, and Mrs. Franks went limp. Efforts were made to trace the call, but the connection had been broken long before telephone authorities could be advised. A doctor was summoned to the bedside of the boy's mother, and the father and Mr. Edelston began to talk it over. "I believe it's a prank," suggested Mr. Edelston consolingly. "I hope to God," murmured his friend. "I hope to God you're right, but I'm afraid not. Oh, I am afraid not." "The best thing we can do, I believe, is see the police," said Mr. Edelson. "I'd rather not," Mr. Franks objected. "I believe Robert is in a serious predicament. To employ the police might jeopardize his life. We'd better wait till morning for the letter." "Sam," murmured Robert's father in a startlingly different voice, Do you think Robert is dead?" The friend, a wonderful friend, met the question masterfully. "Come now, Jacob. Your nerves are running away with you. Listen, the police have every facility for tracing Bobby. Now's the time to put them to work. If we wait, we take unnecessary chances. If we strike back swiftly, everything will be in our favor. Here's your coat. Let's be off." Mr. Franks and Mr. Edelson drove directly to the Detective Bureau at 180 North LaSalle Street. It was a gloomy, dingy structure laden with the dust of the streets. 3 reporters inside were on duty, one from the City Press, another from the Chicago Tribune, and a third from the Chicago Herald-Examiner. Chief of Detective Michael Hughes, known to his friends and admirers as Go Get 'em Mike, was in his office. "Why, hello there, Sam," he greeted when he caught sight of Mr. Edelson. "What are you doing in a place like this at this time of night?" "Chief," retorted the visitor solemnly, "this is Mr. Franks, president of the Rockford Watch Company. You know him, of course. Something terrible's happened to, Mr. Franks. There's been a kidnapping and—" "What? Come in here. Step into my office. Jim Gortland! Oh, Gortland! Listen, Jim, get rid of those reporters. This is serious business. I don't want any newspapers around. Take them out to lunch. Now come and be seated, gentlemen." "Say nothing of any of this to anyone," Mr. Franks began. "On the way down here, I gave my friend the impression that I would put this matter in the hands of the police, but I've been thinking it over, and I've decided otherwise. I'm willing to take your advice. I'm about ready to take anybody's advice, but this Mr. Johnson warned me of the consequences of going to the police." "Well, I can assure you," said the detective, "that the best detective talent in Chicago will help you out." "Well, yes, I appreciate that," answered Mr. Franks. "But I'm thinking of my son. Don't you see? I'm afraid of the risk." "Well, I believe he's right, Chief," interposed Edelson. "I believe the wisest thing we can do is go along with these men, these kidnappers. God, the word makes me shudder. Here's the deal, Chief. When Robert, Mr. Frank's son, failed to return home from school, his father called on me and we went hunting for him. Robert goes to the Harvard School, a private boys' school a few blocks from his home. Mr. Franks lives at 5052 Ellis Avenue. Well, we canvassed the neighborhood for the next 2 hours, but without any success. Finally, we went over to the school building and we crawled through an open window and searched the place from top to bottom, hoping that maybe Robert had fallen asleep after being locked in. There was no sign of him. Well, a little after 9 o'clock, Mr. Johnson calls Frank's home on the telephone and Mrs. Frank answers, and here's what he said." Edelson handed Chief Hughes a penciled transcript of the message that had caused Mrs. Franks to faint. "Are these the exact words?" "I'm reasonably certain they are," said Mr. Edelson. Mused Chief Hughes. "This is a very serious matter. Personally, I think we ought to assign the police to the case, whether it seems like proper procedure or not." For a quarter of an hour or more, the three debated the delicate problem, any decision about which seemed fraught with unspeakable dangers to the life and well-being of young Robert Franks. In the end, the father won out. His persistency in the belief that if the police interfered, his son would be murdered eventually broke down the arguments of the other two. Something in the nature of a compromise was effected instead. Mr. Franks consented to have the police investigate in a sort of indirect way, but there were to be no attempts to get in direct contact with the kidnappers. It was midnight when Mr. Franks and Mr. Edelson headed back to Mr. Franks' home. They made ready for an all-night vigil beside the telephone. At the behest of the police, the telephone authorities supervised all calls coming into the Franks' home. While the mysterious Mr. Jacob had stated that he would furnish further instructions in the morning, he had neglected, or perhaps expressly omitted, to say just when he would supply that precious formula that would bring back Robert Franks. Hence it was an all-night vigil that the father and the friend kept. Through the black pressing silence of the early morning hours, they kept vigil, talking softly for a time and then lapsing into seemingly endless intervals of complete quiet, during which periods, no doubt, the fondest hopes developed the hue of false illusion. Hey everybody, we're back. Thank you for taking a moment to support the brands that support Kinda Murdery. Phew, this is a heavy story. It's hard to tell. I can think of no greater horror than losing your child, but it's also one of the most famous cases in U.S. history and a pretty interesting study of a time period and of horrible criminal minds. I'd like to take a moment now to remind you, as I often do, of the free 3-digit number 988 that you can call to immediately receive counseling for substance use, mental health, or suicidal thoughts. Dial 988 and your call will immediately be answered by someone who cares. Please, program it into your phone and always remember that the world is a better place with you in it. And if you're not going through a crisis, but if you just like to make a connection with another human being or have somebody to talk to, please feel free to reach out to me, kindamurdery@gmail.com. Also, as a reminder, I have cerebral palsy, and I would love Kinda Murdery to be a support community for people with disabilities, physical or otherwise. And honestly, the goal of that is just that we all share our unique life experiences with other people so that perhaps the entire community gets to be exposed to ideas and thoughts and experiences that they hadn't considered before, because the more we can humanize each other, the more empathy we can achieve. So whether or not you're disabled, feel free again to reach out to me and share your story, and we can keep it between us, or I can share it on the show. That's up to you. Also, don't forget that I've got those cool full-color vinyl Kinda Murdery stickers, and please do leave reviews. It really helps. It doesn't just make me feel good, it makes the pod more visible so that other people can find it and our community can grow. But also, I'll be honest with you, it does make me feel good. I love to hear from you guys. I love to know that I'm not just speaking into a void. It's great to get the feedback. It makes all of this worthwhile. So please do leave reviews. Shoot me an email, kindamurdery@gmail.com. Connecting with people is really what storytelling is all about, and bringing us all together is what I hope to do with Kinda Murdery. And with that, let's get back to this terrible, horrible, no good, very bad story. Buckle up for the Chicago horror, Leopold and Loeb, because Kinda Murdery resumes now. Through the black pressing silence of the early morning hours, they kept vigil, talking softly for a time and then lapsing into seemingly endless intervals of complete quiet, during which periods, no doubt, the fondest hopes developed the hue of false illusion. At 9 o'clock in the morning, there was a noise of swift feet on the stairs, and the doorbell was rung vehemently. Mr. Edelson was met by a mailboy bearing a special delivery letter addressed to Mr. Franks. It was torn open by a trembling hand, and its contents were as follows. Dear Sir, as you know by this time, your son has been kidnapped. You need fear no physical harm for him, provided you live up carefully to the following instructions, and such others as you will receive by future communications. Should you, however, disobey any of our instructions, even slightly, his death will be the penalty. For obvious reasons, make absolutely no attempt to communicate with either the police, authorities, or any private agency. Should you have already communicated with the police, allow them to continue their investigations, but do not mention this letter. Secure before noon today $10,000. This money must be composed entirely of old bills of the following denominations: $2,050 bills, $8,020 bills. The money must be old. Any attempt to include any new or marked bills will render the entire venture futile. The money should be placed in a large cigar box, or if that is impossible, in a heavy cardboard box, securely wrapped and bound in white paper. The wrapping paper should be sealed at all openings with sealing wax. Remain at home until 1 o'clock p.m. See that the telephone is not in use. As a final word of warning, this is a strictly commercial proposition, and we are prepared to put our threat into execution should we have reasonable grounds to believe that you have committed one infraction of the above instructions. However, should you carefully follow the instructions to the letter, we can assure you that your son will be safely returned to you within 6 hours after receipt of the money. Yours truly, George Johnson. Mr. Johnson had scored heavily. If his ends were terrorization, he achieved them over and over again. Not a robust man, Mr. Franks could hardly contain himself. He sank into a chair, trembling as though he were about to be seized with hysteria. Bewildered and overwhelmed, he could only give a wild stare of terror in answer to the repeated pleadings of his friend, who sought to console and sustain him. The cool, deliberate tone of the letter was terrorizing. The character of its composition, too, was baffling. Who, with sufficient intelligence to write such a letter, would abduct and threaten to murder harmless little Robert Franks? Where and how did such a monster exist? Equally frightening was the self-confidence of the kidnapper or kidnappers. He was sure of his ground, apparently, for he was content to let the police continue their investigations. In the event, they had already been employed. There remained in the end but one course: to accede wholly to the wishes of Mr. Johnson. In his hands was the precious fate of little Robert. Like a shield, the very life of the boy stood between the kidnapper and his victims, rendering them as helpless and powerless as the boy who had been kidnapped. It was like shooting into a dark room where one could not distinguish between friend and foe and fight back. Mr. Franks set off for the bank to draw out $10,000. The press, the neglected press, the newspaper men were still waiting for the break, which is to say any break. The city editor was munching today's hard apple. Mr. Ryan at Hyde Park was drawing joy and nectar from a narrow bottle and poking fun at the government. Then, the hell that puts the newspaper world on its toes, transforms some tranquil editorial rooms into madhouses, broke loose in a bust that jarred reporterdom. The story of the hour. The crime of the century. It was just the beginning. Mr. Ryan heard about it, requested his informers to quit kidding, and lay down in a pure whiskey stupor, which he hoped would and did last for 2 days. Now it was time for the police to let loose. Everything was out, and everything would have to be in the open. Chief Morgan A. Collins summoned the detective officials into conference. He told them that this was the opportunity of their lives. Detective Lieutenants William Shoemaker and Michael Grady were put in active charge with the authority to draw upon such of the powers of the police department as would be in the interest of their investigations. I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Shoemaker was one of the police detectives involved in the strange case of Harry Church, the man who murdered the car salesman so that he wouldn't have to pay for the car. If you haven't listened to that one, go ahead and listen to it. It's called The Strange Tale of Harry Church. It's called The Strange Tale of Harvey Church. So anyway, William Shoemaker and Michael Grady were put in active charge with the authority to draw upon such of the powers of the police department as would be in the interest of their investigations. Thus, while Mr. Franks faced with dread a foe he had never seen, Chief Hughes prepared to run him down, cost what it might and necessitate what it would. Simultaneously, a dozen detective squads were assigned to strategic points throughout the city in the scheme of covering up, which is the procedure of tapping all possible sources of information. By an indirect process of elimination, the detective squads boiled the Franks case down to the point where it became fairly obvious that the kidnapping was not the work of organized criminals or gangsters. While the nature of the ransom letter gave rise to this assumption, the work of the detectives added logic to the supposition because they were able to give a reasonable account of the conduct of all the gangs, and especially those that were in the kidnapping business. "The motive for the kidnapping of Robert Franks," declared Chief Hughes in a statement issued to the press after he had heard the reports of his detective squads, "is ransom money. $10,000 is not a lot of money for kidnapping, but the kidnappers appear to be of judicious persons. It's logical that they did not ask for $50,000 for fear that the father would resist or find it inconvenient to raise the sum." Such official admissions as these, issued as they were at various times by detectives, investigators, and criminologists, fanned the fires of sensation in every newspaper reader's breast. It was like some dramatic detective novel. In a brief time, a city of 3 million people had completely forgotten about sales projects, time clocks, and daily traction controversy to play investigator and Sherlock Holmes against real-live kidnappers in a, quote, million-dollar, unquote, atmosphere. Police officials were ready to swear to this truth, for with the passing hours, the developments of the case brought an avalanche of amateur sleuths and freelance investigators down upon the city's head, until the town was fairly overrun with mail-order operatives and self-authorized agents of the long arm of the law. Indeed, there was an imminent danger that length and growth would be the arm's undoing, and there was need of restraint upon the activities of these persons. Many of them were squelched in the beginning. Others persisted doggedly and perhaps contributed to the official undertaking. Maybe. Attention was focused upon the ransom missive. Its outward character was that of the conventional letter. It bore a Chicago dateline, and the salutation was the formal "Dear Sir." The stamp of the registry at the post office was 2 p.m. at the Hyde Park station, which meant that the letter had been mailed but a few blocks from its final destination. Here, in the opinion of the detectives, was an example of sheer daring or abysmal ignorance. This was not only the familiar coming back to the scene of the crime, but it was returning before the crime had been fully committed. That deduction only served to further complicate a complex situation. Copies of the fateful letter were given to the press for publication. Suddenly, the secretary to the detective chief and a newspaper man noted the similarity of the letter to another in some way or another. Where had they seen it before? The secretary suddenly remembered a story that had been running serially in a detective magazine. "The Kidnapping Syndicate" was the title. It was a strikingly gruesome yarn having to do with the kidnapping of a rich man's wife by a gang calling itself the Syndicate. That there was a pronounced, if only intangible, relation between this kidnapping of fiction and the one of fact was strangely evident in the two letters whose contents were too identical for coincidence. The numerous points of resemblance between this and the letter quoted earlier will be readily observed and might well be noted because of its later significance. The fictional ransom note from the fictional story The Kidnapping Syndicate read as follows. Your wife is in our custody, and so long as your conduct toward us warrants, she shall be treated with every courtesy and respect, and insofar as the circumstances permit will be made comfortable. Any change in this attitude will be the result of your own defiance to our terms, which are, number 1, that you make no appeal to the police or to any private detective agency. In that event, the amount stated below is automatically doubled, and let us assure you it will avail you nothing and only bring great anguish to yourself and your wife. Upon receipt of $50,000 in bills of $10 and $20 denominations delivered at the time and place under the conditions you will receive later, Mrs. Griswold will be returned to you within a few hours thereafter. Acceptance of these terms are to be conveyed to us as follows. You will leave your house tomorrow morning wearing a white carnation on the lapel of your coat, and wear it all day. Following this, we shall send you further instructions as to how, when, and where the money shall be paid. Signed, The Kidnapping Syndicate. When the kidnappers of Robert Franks are captured, said Chief Hughes after comparing the notes, a copy of that magazine, or that particular page in the magazine, will be found on their property or person. Insomuch as the point about the finding of the magazine was not conceived in the conventional police element, so to speak, Chief Hughes was a prophet with honor in a foreign realm. However, later developments which brought up successive contradictions of the chief's reconstruction of the crime deflated confidence that the kidnappers would ever be captured and substantiated, if only temporarily. But this was not because of incompetence or negligence on the part of the police. This was, after all, the crime of the century. Satisfied that they'd gotten all out of the letter that their eyes could see and their brains could detect, the police solicited the aid of science to give the letter a last microscopic examination for what further clues it might have held. An expert employed by the Royal Typewriter Company, H.P. Sutton, was engaged by the police to study it with the view of determining the make of the machine used to type it. After a few hours of research, Mr. Sutton reported on the typographical clues. He asserted that it was written on an Underwood machine. Another expert later declared a Corona was used. The various light and heavy impressions of the type letters revealed that the writer was an inexperienced typist. Here was Mr. Sutton, the expert's commentary. The letter was typed by the four-finger process, Mr. Sutton stated. When the touch system is used, the impressions are uniformly heavy or light, never both. In this case, the tendency for the writer was to hit some keys harder than others. In many instances, the keys made such depressions as to almost perforate the paper. This shows that the writer was hesitant and deliberate. Asked outright if he could identify the machine, the expert said that he could. Hence it was written into the official police program. Look out for this typewriter. An Underwood, as mentioned. The first police developments in the search for the kidnappers came with the technical arrest of several instructors at the Harvard school where Robert was a student. The faultless composition of the letter, the police said, did suggest the hand of an educated person, and they were unwilling to omit the school supervisors from suspicions. Instructors R.P. Williams and M.N. Mitchell, teachers of English, were taken to a nearby police station and questioned by Lieutenant Grady. They vigorously denied every inference of guilt. At the same time, the testimony of a number of boy students implicated one of the school's teaching staff in alleged acts of perversion. The detective seized upon this as a logical motive for the kidnapping of the boy, but with the intention of murder rather than of ransom. This angle of investigation, however, fell through, and the personnel of the school were wholly absolved of guilt and released within a few hours of being taken into custody. Their release knocked every pillar of support from under the police case, with the result that the kidnapping mystery became deeper and more baffling than ever before. In truth, the ace investigators and the veteran detectives, with scores of solved kidnapping cases to their credit, were forced to admit that they were stumped, simply confronted with a big, blank wall, and nothing on the other side. They were not even able to establish a motive. Why, asked commentators in the press, would the kidnappers abduct a 15-year-old boy for the $10,000 ransom, when by selecting a boy of 5 or 6 years old they could eliminate the possibility of being identified by their captor? While this served to clear the atmosphere a little, it also contradicted every previous theory and depreciated immeasurably the value of the few clues that the police had succeeded in obtaining. It was at this stage that the Chicago press sent in its reporters and journalistic experts with the very natural newspaper idea of forcing along a great story that was tottering perilously on its last legs. Criminologists, private investigators, and famous detectives were hired by the dozens to write discussions of the case and to analyze each new development. Police reporters were paired with their colleagues who did the writing, while the beat man did the investigating. Working hours for the nightmen soon overlapped the hours of the daymen, until at one time there were as many as 150 reporters working on the case together. The competition was keen, and it was not long before the whole group sensed the individual intentions of each member to get the scoop first. Frequently their paths crossed, with unkind words and verbal fisticuffs as consequence. There was no time for physical combat. Much as these functionaries might have wanted to indulge in it, the prize would come only to the swift and sure. In contrast to this, of course, the attitude of Mr. Ryan of High Park was in gross violation of every newspaper principle of news gathering. Concerted efforts on the part of several of his friends to wake Mr. Ryan from his alcoholic dreams were pathetically futile. If you'll remember, Mr. Ryan was the drunk reporter sitting in a bar passed out for 2 days when the story began. "Big story," Mr. Ryan would repeat, quirking his brow with great labor. "Big story, huh? Say, I've been right here for 66 hours. Don't kid me, boys. Life is too short. Too short." And in a voice laden with pathos, Mr. Ryan would tell of the vision in which he saw his old gray-haired mother scrubbing and washing a path to her lonely grave, and dragging a heavy, cumbersome coffin behind her. After this he would subside, take another swig of an almost empty bottle, and fall asleep. But Mr. Ryan's conduct was far from typical. Indeed, it was quite the exception. Industry of the most fervent and dynamic quality characterized every other newspaper man's associations with the case. Home was a place you made split-second renewal of old and familiar acquaintances, coffee was the antidote for sleep, ham sandwiches and malted milk substituted for the more nourishing but inconvenient foods. Eating and sleeping, in short, were looked upon as vicious, alien habits, and an indulgence that was regarded with professional abhorrence. "What the hell do I care if you haven't eaten?" declared an outraged city editor in answer to a reporter's gastronomic prayer. "The only thing that's getting fed around here is the press." By the time the legions of reporters had run down the various sets of clues and published their stories, certain angles of the official investigation were promising important developments. Relentless house-to-house canvassing and questioning established to the satisfaction of Captain William Shoemaker of the Chicago Detective Bureau that Robert Franks had been kidnapped in broad daylight at the corner of 49th Street and Ellis Avenue. Close upon the heels of this came the statement of a servant working in a home located at the corner that had barely seen the figure of a boy stepping into a machine. A peculiar angle of vision prevented her from seeing what type of car it was, or from noting the size or age of the boy, she said. Her disclosure gave rise to the assumption that Robert had been lured away by someone who knew him, and whom the boy knew as well. A sage wrote many years ago that out of every human chaos arises a genius to be the valiant hero of the situation. Whether it's a national conflict or a crisis at an Irish wake, Xerxes or Officer Moriarty will surely appear in the guise of the goddess of victory or peace and bring solid order out of hopeless chaos. Such a genius was sorely needed in this, the most trying hour of the investigation into the terrifying kidnapping of a rich man's son. And then the genius came, or rather they did, in the persons of an Irish and a Jewish cub reporter on the staff of the Chicago Daily News. Plain ornery sitting was the chiefly life's purpose for these two cubs previous to the discovery of the crime of the century. Usually it was sitting on the edge of a desk. When they were inspired to do bigger things, on the other hand, the city editor told them they could sit on the desk's middle. Rarely did duty ever impose more than this, for James Mulroy and Alvin Goldstein were cubs, beginners, freshmen. But opportunity was sneaking up on them from behind. Mulroy and Goldstein were following the newspaper accounts of the Frank case with wolfish eyes. They devoured every item of the story and added in their imagination what they thought would make it complete. Hence, they did not miss the significance of an incidental report from the coroner's office that the nude body of a boy had been found in a swamp in Heggswich, an unsettled territory fringing on Chicago's southern extremities, on May 22nd. "Hey, boss?" Mulroy stammered. "Goldstein and I got a whale of an idea on this Franks case. Will you assign us? I'm almost sure we can produce." "That's a large order, Mulroy," answered the city editor. "At least half a dozen of your seniors here would get the preference. Give me the tip anyway, and we'll have it checked up." "Say, boss," interposed Goldstein, "if you knew what we had would solve the Franks case, would you assign it to us?" "Well, now," the man drawled, "if that's the way you feel about it, I suppose I have no choice in the matter." "Okay," shouted Mulroy and Goldstein, seizing their collegiate hats and dashing out the door. O'Connor and Goldberg, as the two cubs were henceforth addressed by the editor, hailed a cab, and directed the driver to the home of Mr. Frank's brother-in-law. In a few moments, the relative was riding beside them on the way to an undertaking establishment in South Chicago. "You think the body is that of Robert?" asked Robert's uncle, the brother of Mrs. Franks. "The police description of Robert and the coroner's description of the body tally so well that we can't get it off our minds," responded Mulroy. It was a forbidding scene in the dismal undertaker's morgue. Gathered around a clothed form stretched on a slab were the two reporters, nervous with excitement, the uncle of Robert Franks, fearful, apprehensive, and the policeman and the undertaker. The sheet was thrown back to reveal a spectacle that caused every watcher to gasp and shudder. And we'll find out just what that spectacle was after the break. Gathered around a clothed form stretched on a slab were the two reporters, nervous with excitement, the uncle of Robert Franks, fearful, apprehensive, and the policeman and the undertaker. The sheet was thrown back to reveal a spectacle that caused every watcher to gasp and shudder. The body was caked with hard mud, and the face was nearly indistinguishable, but not quite. The uncle leaned over, peered closely. "It's Robert. 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 Oh, Robert." Over and over he spoke the name until the sheet was once again laid over the form of Robert Franks, and the party retired to the front room. Mulroy seized a telephone. "Dearborn, 1111, he called. Then, "City editor, hello, it's Mulroy. Robert Franks has been found. He was murdered, and the body was officially identified. Boss, this is a scoop on every paper in town." At precisely the same hour, the father of Robert Franks was waiting beside his telephone in his home. In his hands, he held a sealed cigar box containing $10,000 in bills of $50 and $20 denominations. Mr. Johnson would call at any moment now with the directions for delivering the ransom money and obtaining the stolen boy. The telephone rang. "Hello?" Mr. Edelson grabbed it up. "This is Mr. Johnson," said the voice. "In 5 minutes, a yellow cab will come to your door. The driver has been instructed as to your destination. Goodbye." A click told that the speaker had hung up, but not quite soon enough. They were tapping wires over which he had been speaking. Telephone authorities traced the call to the original exchange office, but they were not able to pick up any more than that the call had come from a drugstore in the neighborhood of 63rd Street and Cottage Grove Avenue. Exactly 5 minutes afterward, a yellow cab drew up to the curb before Frank's mansion. Mr. Edelson went out in response, and before talking to the driver, made a mental note of the cab's number, which he later said was either 1492 or 1942. "Who sent you here?" Mr. Edelson asked. "Branch office over at Cottage Grove Avenue," answered the driver. "Supposed to pick up Mr. Franks." "Where were you ordered to take him?" "I don't know," responded the driver. "Them's all the orders I got." At this juncture, Mr. Edelson was called into the house by a servant to answer a telephone summons. He had informed the servants they were not to call Mr. Franks to answer the telephone or doorbell. It was the wish of the friend that the father have as little to worry him as possible, although Mr. Franks had not expressly agreed to any such arrangement. He seemed willing to refrain from these duties, so great had been the strain of the terrific ordeal. "It was the grace of God," Mr. Edelson told a friend later, "that Mr. Franks did not answer this particular phone call." Its message cut like a sword and shattered forever the only remaining faint hope, erased the only prayer that had nightly been lifted to heaven from the quiet of the bedchamber where the father and the mother could never find the sweet, peaceful oblivion of sleep. It stirred a home from its anxious loneliness only to pitch it deeper into the undying sorrows of death, into despair, which no amount of ransom money would dispel or ever allay. Even as the dread words came over the instrument into the friend's ears, he could see the tidily wrapped cigar box with its puny, meaningless $10,000. The irresistible force, futility, was riding down the seemingly immovable object, hope, in a truly tragic clash of the Titans. The news of Robert's death was correspondingly horrible in its significance and feeble in its effect upon the boy's parents. The source of their emotions had long since been drained through hope and then through despair. On being told of the fate of his son, Mr. Franks merely shook and then bowed his head. Not a sob escaped from his lips. Not a sound betrayed the presence of the anguish that must have seized him. Fearful relatives postponed telling the mother she was still seriously ill. Suddenly reminded of his interview with the taxi driver, Mr. Edelson hurried outside, but the cab was nowhere in sight. He turned back into the house and telephoned detective headquarters. Discovery of the murder of Robert Franks startled the whole world. Associated Press dispatches flashed the sensational news to all civilization, and newspapers headlined them on the front page with monstrous captions. Reports, too, reached the ears of Mr. Ryan of High Park. Although in the throes of a murderous hangover, he managed to struggle to a telephone and call his city editor. On being connected, he was sharply informed that no such person as Mr. Ryan worked for the city press, and that if he came into the office, the city editor would be obliged to kick him down the stairs. Others, however, were leaving off where Ryan had just begun. Scores of them were racing to the scene of the finding of the boy's mutilated body, while an almost equal number of photographers followed on their trail. Mulroy and Goldstein had already been upon the scene and were interrogating a handful of curious spectators who happened to be by when a railroad laborer espied the dead body. The present theater of events constituted no more than a wide expanse of swamp and weed, which could only be approached from the beaten path by way of a railroad embankment. There was a small path which led from the rails to a wood culvert stretched across a small stream. The body of Robert had been stuffed under the culvert. The finder of the body stated that it was so lodged that half the body, which was not submerged in water, was jammed securely against the culvert's bottom at the point where the culvert joined the stream's bank. So inaccessible was the place, and so well hidden was the body, that all who were gathered there agreed that its finding was some determined act of Providence. The two reporters lost no time in joining detectives from the nearest police station in a minute examination of the territory for possible clues. Sleuth-inclined spectators also lent a hand, so that a fair-sized congregation of policemen, civilians, and reporters were engaged in the hunt. One civilian, Paul Korff, caught sight of a gleaming object lying in the mud under the culvert. Mulroy was standing near when Korff leaned down to study the object. Both recognized it as a pair of horn-rimmed spectacles, whereupon Mulroy judiciously took charge of them, explaining that he was a newspaper reporter and that if anything developed he would let Korff know. The police were not told. Mulroy hurriedly informed his colleague of the find, and while Korff had been given to understand that something might come of those glasses, Mulroy pocketed the spectacles and renewed the search for further clues. Meanwhile, Dr. Joseph Springer, physician for the coroner of Cook County, arrived accompanied by a horde of news-hungry reporters and picture-starved photographers. He had made his cursory examination of the body and wanted a final study of the culvert spot. Plainly, the doctor was puzzled. "I haven't even determined the cause of death yet," he told reporters. "There's a small abrasion on the head in the front and an apparent laceration at the base of the skull. The wounds do not appear to be serious enough to have caused death. On the other hand, there's a light sepia stain about the mouth. It is possible that he was poisoned, although I did not detect the presence of any poison in the stomach." Dr. Springer also disclosed that the face had been burned as if by an acid solution. The physician then proceeded to question Tony Mink, the laborer who came upon the body, after which he made a close examination of the culvert spot. While thus engaged, he was accosted by a young man bearing a metal bar 8 inches long. "Found it just beyond the culvert," announced the youth carelessly. Dr. Springer took it gingerly, produced a handkerchief, and laid the bar in it. Wound about one end was a batch of adhesive tape. The covering was fairly clean, indicating that it had not lain in the swampy ground for long. "I believe," declared Dr. Springer, turning to the waiting reporters, "that this was the instrument that killed Robert Franks." Goldstein and Mulroy waited no longer. Jumping into the cab they'd kept waiting, they were off toward the city, the precious glasses safe in their possession. They had two anxieties: the glasses and the unspeakable amount of the cab bill. Public reaction to press reports that Robert Franks had been murdered and the body had been found was unstinted. People of all races and ages were roused as a crime had never roused them before. The gruesome grave, the brutal circumstances of his apparent death, and the savage act of the kidnappers in leading the father to believe that he was ransoming his son who was already dead, stirred the heart of every newspaper reader. Prominent men spoke their feelings freely. Detectives and investigators pledged themselves to solve the crime and bring the perpetrators to justice swiftly and surely. Deeper indignation followed substantial reports to the effect that the body had been attacked. The police were spurred to a frenzy of activity, and the state's attorney was assigning his best assistants to the investigation. Science was consulted in the person of criminologists, psychologists, and chemists, the latter being given all such objects and articles for analysis as might yield valuable clues. a question and answer symposium of the opinions of Chicago's best detectives and the circumstances of the kidnapping and the murder of the Franks boy, went something like this. Question: who killed Robert Franks? Answer: a kidnapper seeking ransom or a moron? Question: what killed him? Answer: after making every possible examination, the coroner's physician says it must have been caused by suffocation. But why suffocation? Answer: the boy had been choked or strangled. He had not been poisoned. He had been hit on the head with a blunt instrument, but not hard enough to cause death. He was found in 2 feet of water, and although his lungs were copper-colored, he had not been drowned. Suffocation seems the only possible way by which he could have come to his death. Well, question: how was he suffocated? Answer: probably by a handkerchief or a hand pressed to his nose and mouth for a period of about 2 minutes. Why was the boy killed? Now this is a debatable question. If he was killed by a moron, or several of them, he probably was killed accidentally while in a struggle with them, a struggle which induced hemorrhages of the lungs from which he died. Or they may have killed him to cover up their crime, to keep the boy from telling. Question: what if he was killed by the kidnappers? Answer: then also probably in a struggle with his captors and from a hemorrhage of the lungs induced by a hand pressed over the nose and mouth. Indications are that the kidnappers would not have deliberately killed the boy so quickly, at least not until negotiations showed signs of failing and they must make a getaway. Question: when was Robert killed? Answer: probably within a few minutes after he was abducted or lured away while he was struggling for his freedom. Question: where was he killed? Answer: probably in an automobile in the 3-block stretch between his school and his home. The theory is that he could not have been kidnapped or lured away on foot without some of his companions becoming aware of it. Well, what sort of person must the police seek in the murder? Answer: a scholarly person, a master of English. None but such a person could have written the famous letter received by Mr. Franks. Its grammar was faultless. Question: was there any peculiarity in the letter? Answer: yes. The spelling of the word kidnapped, spelled Kidnaped. The strictly English version of the word includes 2 P's. Question: if the boy was killed by kidnappers, why did they persist in their demands for a ransom long after the boy was dead and his unidentified body recovered? Answer: they did not know the body had been recovered and attempted to obtain the ransom money despite his murder. Question: if a moron or several of them killed the boy, why the telephone messages and the letter demanding the kidnapper's ransom? Answer: to cover up the real motive of the crime, to throw detectives off the track, possibly to obtain money for a desperate attempt to get away. Question: what is the more likely theory? Murder by the kidnappers or murder by morons? Answer: no attempt is made to answer this yet. Only the remarkable letter and the suspicions of Mr. Edelson lend a basis to the moron theory. Question: well, was the boy attacked? Answer: coroner's physician says he probably was not, although it is difficult to determine this. Attempts to attack him might have been made, and some form of attacks accomplished without leaving external evidence of violence. Question: was the writer of the erudite letter a good typist? Answer: not according to the findings of Mr. Sutton, the typewriter expert. Question: did the addressing of the envelope in printed letters in ink indicate anything concerning the writer? Answer: yes, it indicated the writer might have known something of cartooning or that he was at least familiar with mechanical drawing and lettering. Question: is it possible that a woman was involved in the slaying? Answer: it is. The pair of eyeglasses found near the culvert seemed to be a woman's. Question: is there any other evidence to indicate a woman's hand in the crime? Answer: nothing. Everything else points to it as the work of a man or men. While this summary clarified the atmosphere on several issues, it only served to further complicate any conception of a motive for the crime or of the character of the guilty person or persons. The crime of the century was defying solution. Meanwhile, Mulroy and Goldstein had secured the assistant state attorney Joseph Savage and were imploring him to do something about the glasses. At the suggestion of the 2 reporters, prosecutor Savage went with them on a canvass of optical firms in Chicago. The first 2 concerns flatly declared there was no way of tracing the glasses. The next shop was the firm of Ulmer Co. and Company. Here, a Mr. Weinstein went over the spectacles thoroughly. "This is a peculiar pair of glasses," he informed the men. "They have a special hinge device which has been patented by a New York firm. The frame possibly was made in New York, and it is altogether likely the lenses were bought here. This company is an agent for that firm." Mr. Weinstein then took the glasses' measurements. These he scribbled on a piece of paper, which was handed in turn to a second clerk. In a moment, the latter had returned, and Mr. Weinstein was reading his notation. "The lenses for these glasses were purchased by Nathan Leopold, 4754 Greenwood Avenue." "That's a swell address," said Goldstein, nudging his partner. "I wonder," answered Mulroy, "if that's the Leopold I knew at the University of Chicago." "Well, broke in the other, let's go see." The two cubs arrived at the Leopold home accompanied by Detective Sergeants Edward Anderson and Hugh Burns of the State Attorney's Office, who had instructions to arrest Nathan Leopold. In response to their knock, a maid came to the door. She greeted them. "How do you do?" "Is Nathan Leopold home?" "Why, yes. Will you wait till I can get him?" "No thanks, lady. We'll step right inside. We're detectives. Where's his room?" Frightened, the maid pointed to a door on the second floor near the stairs. They bounded up just in time to meet Nathan Leopold coming out of his room. He was taken aback by the abruptness of his callers and by apparently nothing more. His curious gaze spoke for an explanation of the strange intrusion. "Nathan Leopold?" asked Sergeant Anderson. "Yes," was the calm answer. "You're under arrest. You have to come with me." "Well, why?" "I can't talk about that now. Will you come along?" Leopold indicated that he would, whereupon he donned his topcoat and hat and left in the company of the detectives. As their car pulled away, a second car drew up, and Captain Shoemaker and his squad got out. Without any delay, they took what seemed to be complete possession of the house. One herded the servants into a single room, a second went out to the garage, a third covered the rooms upstairs. Captain Shoemaker took charge of the questioning of the servants. From them he sought detailed information of the life, habits, and acquaintances of Nathan Leopold. He heard, at any rate, of a unique person. And we'll find out just how unique when Kinda Murdery returns after the break. One week before the day of the kidnapping, Loeb and Leopold drove about the neighborhood of the Harvard School where Robert Franks was a pupil and selected from a number of pupils they knew several likely victims. One was Robert, another the son of Julius Rosenwald, nationally known philanthropist, and a member of the directorate of the Sears Roebuck mail-order house. And the third was a son of a wealthy furniture dealer. With this decision, they arranged for the rental of a Dodge touring car from the Hertz Drive-It-Yourself station. The selection of the culvert spot for the disposal of the victim's body was the child of Leopold's ingenious brain. He knew the territory thoroughly, having been there, as he said, on many expeditions as an ornithologist. On Wednesday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Leopold confessed, "We went to the rental station and obtained a car, which we said we wanted for 2 days. Dick Loeb did the driving and we went to my home, where I put on an auto robe and a pair of boots. Without any delay, we drove to the Harvard School. After circling the block several times, we spotted Robert Franks playing at the corner. We decided then that we would kill him and demand $10,000 ransom from his father. I was sitting in the back and Loeb was in the front driving. Loeb knew Robert best and called him over to our car." "What did Loeb say?" came the question from the assistant state's attorney. "He just said, 'Hey, Bobby, come here,'" was Leopold's reply. Then he asked Robert if he wanted to play some tennis. Robert said he did, and we invited him into the car. While we were starting away, I was getting the chisel out of the pocket in the door of the car and my handkerchief out of my coat. Robert saw the chisel and asked what it was for. Loeb then took his attention away from what I was doing by drawing him into conversation. We'd gone about 2 blocks and then I decided to go ahead. I brought up the chisel and struck Robert on the head. It stunned him and he began to struggle and scream. I seized him around the neck and I clapped the handkerchief over his nose and mouth and I hit him harder with the chisel. Then he went limp. I pulled him over the back of the seat and onto the floor and covered his body with the auto robe. We drove around for about 2 hours waiting for it to get dark, meanwhile driving always in the direction of the culvert at 122nd Street. We arrived at the culvert at about 8:30 and parked the car alongside the main road. Then we stripped the body of clothes and poured the hydrochloric acid over the face. I put my boots on and we carried the body to the culvert. I stood in the water and placed the body close up against the culvert's support, and when I was sure it would not float away in the water, we went back to the car. It was at this time, I think, that my glasses dropped out of my coat pocket." The deed finished, the 2 dastardly murderers proceeded back to the city, stopping en route to bury the boy's clothes in a large prairie. Arriving home, they parked the rental car in Leopold's yard. Then, with a calm air, the pair retired to the dining room of the Leopold home and played several rounds of casino. Later, Loeb bade his friend good night and went home to bed. Leopold followed his example shortly afterward. In the interim, he had stepped out to a drugstore and telephoned the Franks home, informing Mrs. Franks in credible English of the kidnapping of her son. On surveying the car early the next morning, Leopold discovered bloodstains on the back of the seat, the car's floor, and the running board. He also found blood spots on the auto robe. Some of the spots he managed to obliterate. Failing in his efforts to clean the robe, Leopold took it to the nearest lake and burned it. On his way back, he returned the rental car and paid the charges. It was Loeb, he said, who called the Franks home the following day and announced the ransom letter with its instructions was en route. In addition, Loeb called from the Ross drugstore notifying Mr. Edelson that a cab would come to pick up Mr. Franks. Shortly afterward, both heard of the finding of the boy's body and promptly forgot the ransom negotiations with Mr. Franks, although they had already been discouraged in this with the failure of the father to appear at the drugstore. Both then went home to bask in the secretive glory of murderers who were never caught. Such was the tenor of the confession. So read the document that was passed among the congregation of reporters in the old criminal court building. It was a reading of achievement for Mulroy and Goldstein. With weary steps, they made their way out of the building towards home, there to regain dire-needed sleep, and there to invoke the blessing of Providence on their efforts the next day to pass a $135 cab bill on to the city editor. So thoroughly were the master murderers incriminated that it was conceded at once that no lawyer in the state of Illinois, however brilliant or cunning, could be even remotely instrumental in sparing their necks from the deadly embrace of the hangman's hemp. Swiftly were the two conducted through the mill of criminal procedure, so that on being brought to actual justice they would not have had neither the mood nor the time to think of escape from the consequences of their act. A month gone in a flash, and Richard Loeb and Nathan Leopold stood before Judge John R. Caverly in the criminal court, answering to the people of the state for the murder of one of its youths. To Clarence Darrow, the apostle of humanity, the champion of the underdog, was given the title of Chief Counsel for the defense, something in the opinion of the press and the public that existed in no sense at all at the present time for Leopold and Loeb. The defense offered by Clarence Darrow is now famous literature today. Daring in its application of the case at hand, utterly radical in its sense of justice, the Darrow defense, on top of all its concession to the charges of the state, and nothing was denied, nevertheless withstood the terrific hammerings of the prosecution with facts, facts, facts. Someone has said that Darrow did no more than sing the intellectual blues for his clients who read the super-philosophy of Nietzsche and the grotesque comedies of Rabelais at one sitting. Whatever he did, the effect brought a so thoroughly aroused public indignation on the head of Judge Caverly that the worthy man was almost forced to flee the city to escape the torment at the hands of friends as well as enemies. That something of Clarence Darrow's sufficed at any rate for Leopold and Loeb and for their grieving relatives. Judge Caverly himself was moved to run counter to a fierce sentiment, and he saved the defendants from the gallows by sentencing them to prison. For the murder they got life imprisonment, and for the kidnapping 99 years. The sentences to run concurrently, oddly enough. For weeks afterwards, Judge Caverly was the target of editorial writers, priests, rabbis, ministers, and Toastmasters, not a few remarks being made publicly, passed on by some of his intimate friends, too. Obviously money. The money that was able to purchase great legal talent prevented two heirs from taking what certainly would have otherwise been a death march. A large, perhaps negligible part of the public misconstrued application of the term money to the success of the defense. To them it meant that the judge was bribed. But nothing is more unreasonable and out of the question. Judge Caverly's integrity was above reproach. Leopold, with all his academic genius, became a trusty acting clerk and assistant to the prison chaplain at Joliet Penitentiary, while Loeb labored in the rattan factory. But very little news of them ever leaked out. They received one annual holiday when they were permitted to see one relative for a few hours. And gradually, the crime of the century became just another sordid entry in the long annals of American true crime history, destined to spawn books, movies, and, likely, more than one podcast episode. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here with me. I appreciate you all very much. I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.
If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.